Hey guys. So PACE was funded for a number of proposals over the course of different funds in Catalyst, and each of those proposals was really targeted at helping to improve Catalyst. And since starting to execute some of the proposals, we've had a number of issues and blockers that have emerged that have really prevented us from executing those proposals, or even if we were able to execute them, potentially even creating much impact at all. Now, over time, I think some of these issues and blockers are now starting to be resolved, but we also have a number of concerns for some of the Catalyst and identity focused proposals that we have moving forward. So we're not sure whether they are going to deliver the amount of impact we were hoping for in the current environment. So with that in mind, we'll cover all those kind of areas here, and in a subsequent presentation, I will go over how we intend to mitigate those issues moving forward. So the first main issue and blocker we faced was around Catalyst data sources. The first kind of main problem we had was lots of data was quite scattered and hard to find in the beginning. It was kind of either within documents or not really easily available. And currently the data is only read access available. So you couldn't really make any active kind of changes to suggesting new ways of doing things for writing that data to the process. So this is really important for the tools, the insights, and the improvements that you're going to make for trying to improve the process, which impacted pretty much all of our Catalyst-focused proposals. Now, the current situation is that a lot of this data has been moved into Google Sheets, so it's now much more easily accessible. It's more programmable. You can use the Google Sheets API. However, the liveness of this data isn't always fully up to date. So, for instance, the IdeaScale data, you can't access that immediately unless you're scraping the website, and then you're fully reliant on that website not changing. So then you're scraping it. It actually works. The future and better long-term solution for this will be to have a Catalyst API, and that is actually going to be released sometime by the Catalyst team. And also eventually the Catalyst will be open source, so that will help enabling or making sure you have that you can integrate that software and have the read and write access for being part of the process with your own solutions and however you want to make changes. The second issue and block we faced is around the lack of community stewardship. So this is really about the decision making and the governance of how Catalyst is managed. Now, currently, the key problem there is that IOG has full control over the Catalyst process and ultimately makes any final decisions made. Is it their full discretion on what exactly gets changed? The community may be invited to participate in what those decisions should be, but ultimately it's still IOG that at the end of that will decide what does and doesn't get approved. So the importance of this is to have that shared responsibility in decision making. We're going to really need that community stewardship to make it possible. So whether that's overall kind of voting on the overall process or more specific things like inviting that participation and actually votes on that will really kind of distribute that kind of ownership and responsibility. The current situation is so controlled and run by the Catalyst team by IOG, but in the future the Catalyst team is currently requesting funding from the Treasury for Fund 10. And that is a good step forward because it means that they're kind of now starting to follow some of the same processes that we are. And it also could mean, hopefully, that the Catalyst team could have more autonomy from IOG. So it kind of operates independently as a team of, I think it's around 20. That then means that that team can be very transparent about this is how the team operates, here's the decisions that are being made, and very clearly how the community be involved in those decisions if they're working very independently rather than under a larger, bigger corporate umbrella. And then the other kind of hopeful kind of outcome that would be great to see with this issue and block in the future is potentially a contributor funding model. So if the community could elect some other community members to be paid for by the Treasury to work with the Catalyst team, then that's a good way to kind of for the community to delegate some responsibility to community members to participate in some of those internal decisions and contribution effort to making some of those governance and changes being made. And the next kind of issue and blocker we faced was around the actual making changes to the process itself. So it doesn't really matter what you execute or suggest to making changes to Catalyst, whether that change gets adopted or not is ultimately down to IOG. So there's currently a lack of ability for the community to make those changes. And the importance of this is if you want the community to have easy contribution and involvement in making changes to Catalyst and be able to experiment and trial new things to improve it, then you have to have some sort of process or easy way for them to do that. Now, there's a few ways that could be achieved. So we have like processes for changing the official process itself. So being able to suggest changes, then getting voted on, or whether it's you don't even need to have permission and then be able to trial something new in the actual process itself. But we also have the situation where once Catalyst is open source, we could have product development kind of experiments and trials of the same kind of tech stack being used in different contexts. So, other communities also trialing similar different things. So there's a few different ways we can achieve that in parallel. In terms of the current situation, as I mentioned, the IOG is currently making all the changes. Catalyst is funded by IOG. And in the future, the Catalyst team is requesting funding, as mentioned in the previous kind of issue. And a similar kind of situation where hopefully the autonomy will mean it's going to be easier for the community to be involved in some of the actually making changes to the system and technical processes. And hopefully maybe a contributor model would allow for the community to be involved in actively working on the system itself and making those changes with the team in parallel. And then the final issue of blocker we faced was around Atala Prism identity. So we started, it was in Fund 6, the first Atala Prism challenge kind of came out, and we were in the Pioneers course in that. And it was only after doing that became more clear that there wasn't a reference implementation for an identity wallet, and also some of the initial versions of Atala Prism were, some of the initial bare versions of making verifiable credentials work. They didn't necessarily follow the full DID spec and everything around it. And the importance of obviously this was that you needed that infrastructure and all that kind of software to make the impactful identity products and experiments that people were proposing. And the current situation for this one is there's community efforts around identity wallets such as the Roots wallet and Proofspace, and they're starting to mature now. You can start to kind of use those. And then we also have an upcoming release for Atala Prism that's going to follow the full DID specs. So that's also going to mean, I think, a few other things such as DIDCOM and some of the other areas that have been growing in the identity space. So that issue is hopefully really kind of starting to be resolved over the coming kind of weeks and months. But even with those issues and blockers that we just mentioned, some of them are starting to be resolved now. But even with those resolved, we still have some concerns moving forward about the actual impact some of our proposals will make, even if they are executed once those are resolved. So some examples of that for the Catalyst focused ones would be that if we are making independent solutions for different parts of the funding process, we have concerns that if we're using a different tech stack, this is just going to mean harder maintenance for the overall process. Let's say that our separate solution is adopted and becomes almost like an official part of the process. Well, if the Catalyst team themselves, for instance, started using that same solution and maintaining it, then they may have to learn a new tech stack to then actually work on that solution. Alternatively, if they say, well, that's a really good solution and it works and we're going to adopt it, they may actually have to recreate it in their own tech stack fully, which then just means completely duplicated effort there to then recreate a similar thing. And that's a wasteful outcome. The next area of concern would be around the security integrations. So if you have lots of independent and I make a separate solution for something, for a part of the funding process, then there's a concern about how that data is integrated and also how you're doing the read and writes of interacting with the chain. So if you make a mistake or you're not reading the information correctly, there's a chance that you negatively influence the outcomes and experience for the user going through the funding process. And you also have these kind of security concerns where there could be a bug or you do something wrong, and that could actually impact the final result. So that makes it more difficult for the official team, which is Catalyst at the moment, who's going to maintain the main process, to then endorse and really support all of these separate solutions, because there's that risk that something is wrong unless they've checked it. And then you also have the obvious security concern that a malicious actor could be there. So what if you have lots of these different solutions that are just trying to make small changes to improve the process? What if one of those actors is malicious and they actually manage to achieve, they deploy something and deploy something subsequently near the voting process where they actually influence the final result of the funding round, and that would really stagnate some of the funding distribution. The other key concern we have is around, if we're making these separate kind of tools and solutions, is that even if we can get adoption on those in any capacity and we push for that adoption, we are actually making a more disjointed user experience. Instead of doing some A/B experiments and tests within the funding process itself and trying to improve that core stack, we are adding to the complexity of the process by saying, for this part of the funding process, if you go to this different solution, you'll get, you can do X, Y, and Z, but that then just adds more complexity. And as the Catalyst process is already fairly complex, it is really something I'm trying to avoid. It's already very difficult to get high participation in governance. To add any extra complexity really needs to be very well justified. So the more elegant solution here is to try to keep this as close to the main stack as possible and do more A/B tests and experiments rather than making completely new solutions for one part of the process. This is very costly, and also just really is not the user experience you're trying to encourage. The next area is if you have independent solutions for each part of the funding process emerging and trying to experiment different things, it's very easy for those not to get funding in subsequent rounds, because if there's lots of different competing things, then that can easily lead to stagnation in development of that, or even just abandonment. It makes it much more expensive to kind of maintain all of that those different solutions. And this again leads to that it makes more sense on economical terms to kind of do those experiments and those simple trials within the existing kind of tools and software as much as possible, because then the cost of maintaining that and making changes and working out the conclusions of those hypotheses tests are going to be much lower, rather than having to duplicate loads of parts of maybe the stack to then do a small amount of testing. The more economically you can do that, the easier it's going to be to maintain that financially over the long term. And then finally, we have this kind of duplicate efforts and solutions. So we're concerned that if we have 2, 3, 4 different solutions for the same part of the Catalyst funding process, that there's a lot of parts of those solutions that are going to be very duplicated, rather than being novel and new. It's like requirements of functional infrastructure and functional process that are needed to make that work that could be similar across each of the solutions. And each of that duplication does not provide value. Is what is the key part that you're trying to test, and what's the easiest way you can do that? We think that that's most likely going to be easiest doing some sort of A/B test within the main process, rather than completely making a separate solution. So these are ongoing concerns we have. We're just trying to create lots of different independent tools and solutions within Catalyst funding process. And then onto our identity proposals. The key concern I have on these ones is that some of the credential ideas we had in the proposal, looking at the ecosystem and the processes at the moment, there isn't an obvious path for some of these credentials to gain adoption and actually have that easy path to creating impact. So that covered some of the skills, the participation and completion credentials. A lot of these are really non-essential, that they may be adopted for some short period of time just for the interest in them, but it was very easy for the outcomes of these proposals to be flash in the pan kind of outcomes where they didn't actually lead to meaningful end results. And as I've mentioned in a previous presentation and some documentation about creating impact, that is the only important outcome. It's creating impact. It's the open source software might provide some value, but we want to align ourselves most effectively and efficiently with how can we actually create impact in something that will make some meaningful change. And the only credential that we've thought of so far that could is much more likely to achieve that would be a contributor credential. So, for instance, if the Catalyst contributors is one model I've been pushing for over a year at this point. If the Catalyst team introduced a category where people could be elected as contributors to support the work within the Catalyst team, and let's say 3 people were elected, each of those people could receive a credential for the term that they're going to be contributing towards improving the process. And then within any internal decisions and some of the governance side that happens within that team dynamics, they could vote for any of those decisions with their credential and use it in those kind of things, or for even wider, more governance decisions. You could use the credential for governance related reasons. So you actually have an immediate path for actually gaining some adoption and use case for that credential. So we feel that's a really good use case for actually trialing and experimenting with some of the initial wallets that are being created and actually playing with some new credentials. That is it in terms of some of the issues and blockers we have and the concerns we have moving forward. I've covered some of the issues and blockers in more detail in some separate documentation. But in a subsequent video, I will cover how we intend to mitigate and prevent some of these issues and blockers and the concerns moving forward as we find better ways to kind of allocate our time. Thank you for listening.